Hey there! Yeah, I haven't been on here much lately, especially since I was starring in an episode of Disney Plus's The Wonderful World of Mickey Mouse, entitled The Big Good Wolf. If you have Disney Plus, check it out! But enough shameless plugs, because the holiday season is upon us once again, as if you couldn't tell by my festive hat here. And with the pandemic going on, we could use some holiday cheer. And so I thought I'd share some here with another interesting chapter in the history of Disney Records read-along book and audio sets. Look at that. You can see how it's simply titled Jingle Bells, a story by Don Ferguson. This title came out in 1987 as a cassette-only read-along, since earlier that year Disneyland Records had discontinued read-along records, focusing on releasing them on compact cassette only, as they were presumably easier for kids to handle, along with the relative portability of cassettes and their players, like this here, along with there being quite a few tape recorders made for kids, like from Fisher-Price and Play School and even Sony, and they were also ideal for long car rides, as cassette decks in automobiles were growing in popularity during the 80s. But tape cassette history aside, this is an original story Disney Records came up with, presumably because before this, Disneyland Records did have a Jingle Bells read-along as part of their Little Gold Book and Record, or cassette line, a read-along of the 1964 Little Gold Book Jingle Bells. The read-along version came out in 1976. But starting in 1986, Western Publishing began producing and releasing their own book and audio sets on cassette, and so they ended their ties with Disneyland Records, leading those Disney co-productions to be taken off the market. Even though Western Publishing did reissue a few of those Golden Christmas read-alongs co-produced with Disney, including Jingle Bells, onto cassette in 1987. Well, Disney did need to fill quite a few gaps with their Golden read-along co-productions being discontinued, along with the record editions or their other read-alongs. And so they came up with things like remaking several of the generic fairy tale adaptation read-alongs under the Disney Presents Your Favorite Fairy Tales name, and finally remaking the Aristocats read-along to tie into that film's theatrical reissue that year, and coming out with a couple of Christmas read-along titles, including an adaptation of the 1978 featurette The Small One, and this one here, which is a completely different but still cute story. Gee, 1987 was a pretty busy year for Disneyland Records, now called Disneyland Vista Records and Tapes. For instance, they also came out with this really fun LP album, Mickey's Rock Around the Mouse. And they also began releasing compact discs then, with their first one being a reissue of the 1980 Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Storyteller album, to tie in with that movie's 50th anniversary reissue. Along with the holiday CD, Disney Presents A Family Christmas, which of course also had a cassette release right here. It contains mostly tracks from those two Larry Gross Disneyland Christmas albums from 1979 and 1980. And you'll be hearing a track from one of these albums after the story, on the tape, that is. Even though the song does not mention Christmas anywhere, when there's rarely, because it's more or less a general winter song. It's silly to hear it during Christmas time when there's rarely any snow in my area. Heck, right now it's raining outside, hence the somewhat mediocre lighting. You could sing Jingle Bells in February and it'd still be relevant. Like a Donald Snow fight from 1942 not being a Christmas cartoon, and having Donald Duck still sing the song anyways. Well, they still incorporate Christmas into the Jingle Bells story. And it's a period piece set when horse-drawn buggies and sleighs are still the norm for transportation. But enough of this yakking. Let's see the pictures, hear the tape, and read the book.
This is the story of Jingle Bells. You can read along with me in your book. You will know it is time to turn the page when you hear the chimes ring like this.
Of course, that never changed.
Let's begin now. Fanny Bright and her brother Joshua lived with their grandfather on the prettiest farm in Kincaid County. Fanny was 8 years old. Joshua was 15. And grandfather was just about as old as most grandfathers are. Oh yes, and we mustn't forget Charlie. Charlie was their horse. Grandfather was always bringing Charlie tasty treats.
Charlie, you old-timer, here's a nice big carrot for you.
Nobody knew exactly how old Charlie was. Not even Charlie. But for as long as anyone could remember, Grandfather had been hitching him to the plow every spring, to the buggy every summer, and to the harvest wagon every fall. And every winter, for as long as anyone could remember, Charlie was harnessed up to Grandfather's one-horse open sleigh.
Like the
big
song.
Christmas Day sleigh race. Grandfather often said,
No doubt about it, Charlie is one fine horse.
Each year, with Fanny, Joshua,
There's some
and
familiar
Charlie's
read-along
help,
stock music you've heard a few
Grandfather's
times
farm
on
grew
this
bigger,
channel.
with more fields to plow and more crops to harvest. One day, Grandfather hitched Charlie to the buggy and called Fanny and Joshua.
I think it's time for us to get another farm horse.
Aw.
Charlie's getting along in years, and there's too much farm work for him to do alone.
Yeah.
So they climbed in the buggy and rattled off down the road. A short time later, they pulled into McGregor's horse farm. Grandfather waved to Mr.
Now,
McGregor.
this isn't... Oh,
Good
is
day,
McGregor like the one for Peter Rabbit?
Long, young horse to help Charlie on the farm.
I'm sure we'll be able to find just what you need.
And he's a
I have
Scot,
several you can
too.
choose from.
While the two men talked, Fanny and Joshua explored the farm. They looked in the clean white barns, then walked to the pasture fence and watched the horses grazing in the field. Suddenly, one of them trotted toward Fanny. Joshua laughed.
I guess he wants to say hello.
Look at his forehead. That white mark looks just like a bell.
Yep, as you can tell, that's gonna be the main horse of the
Mr.
story.
McGregor were standing outside the stables when Fanny came running up to them. She tugged on her grandfather's hand.
Come and see the horse Josh and I found.
As Grandfather looked over the horse at the pasture fence, Fanny pleaded.
Can't we buy him, Grandfather?
Mr. McGregor spoke up.
He's just what you were looking for.
Grandfather thought for a minute, then looked at Fanny and smiled.
We'll take him.
Grandfather tethered him to the back of the buggy, and they headed for home. On the way, Fanny kept staring at the new horse trotting along behind them.
What will we call him, Grandfather?
You found him, Fanny. I think you should choose the name.
Fanny looked back at the new horse. She saw the mark on his forehead and shouted.
Jingle Bells!
The horse's ears shot up to listen. Fanny grinned.
I think we'll call you Jingle Bells.
Yep, of course. You gotta incorporate that into the
Bells had
story,
never
the
been on
title.
a real farm before. His whole life had been spent on Mr. McGregor's horse farm, where all he had to do was eat and sleep and gallop over the fields. He had never been hitched to a plow or pulled a buggy. On Grandfather's farm, Jingle Bells would have a lot to learn. When they got back from Mr. McGregor's, Fanny gave Jingle Bells a big hug and led him to his stall.
Here you are, boy. This is going to be your new home.
The next day, Grandfather began teaching Jingle Bells how to be a farm horse. During his first lesson, Jingle Bells tangled up his bridle. Grandfather grinned.
He seems a bit clumsy.
During his second lesson, Jingle Bells backed the buggy into a fence. Grandfather shook his head.
He's definitely clumsy.
And on the third day of Jingle Bells' lessons, when he stumbled and pulled Grandfather and his plow into a ditch, Grandfather yelled,
He's the clumsiest horse I've ever seen.
Hey, sometimes there's nothing wrong with clumsy animals.
Grandfather was ready to give up.
Well, Fanny, I think we've made a mistake. Jingle Bells will never learn to be a farm horse. Maybe we should take him back to Mr. McGregor.
Oh no, Grandfather, please. Let me try to teach him. I know he can do it.
Grandfather could see that Fanny would be heartbroken if he sent the horse back.
Of course.
All right, Fanny. Jingle Bells is your pupil now.
All through the fall, Fanny spent her after-school hours working with Jingle Bells in the training paddock.
What about her homework if
Day by
she had
day,
it?
the clumsy horse began to understand the mysteries of the bridle, the harness, and the saddle. Fanny was happy with Jingle Bells' progress, but Grandfather wasn't convinced.
He's still no farm horse, and he'll never be half the horse Charlie is.
Oh, you'll see. Give him time.
When the first snowfall came in late November, Fanny thought of a way to prove Jingle Bells was a good horse. She would enter him in the Christmas Day sleigh race.
Oh.
Fanny asked her brother Joshua to help, but he had his doubts about the idea.
I'm not sure Jingle Bells is ready. Besides, Grandfather will be racing in our sleigh with Charlie.
What about that old sleigh out and back? Let's fix it up for the race.
When Fanny told Grandfather her plan, he looked doubtful too.
I know you've worked hard with Jingle Bells, but he's still clumsy. And a sleigh race can be pretty tricky. Even Charlie had trouble learning to run on that icy road.
But Fanny was confident.
I know he can do it.
For the next month, Fanny and Joshua worked during every spare minute, repairing the old sleigh and training Jingle Bells. A few days before Christmas, they were ready for their first test run.
Just a few days before.
Fanny held the reins lightly.
Okay, boy. Here we go.
Yeah.
Nice and slow at first.
Jingle Bells trotted smoothly down the snow-covered lane.
Now a little faster, boy.
Jingle Bells started a slow gallop. Joshua held on tight.
Okay, Fanny, let's see what he can do.
Fanny signaled Jingle Bells, and he broke into a full gallop. Just then he came to a patch of hard ice on the road. Jingle Bells slipped and slid, sending the sleigh crashing into a snowbank.
Oh, that was a vintage-sounding crash.
Joshua and Fanny got up out of the drift just as Grandfather and Charlie came along. Grandfather sighed.
I know you love Jingle Bells, but he'll be lucky just to stay on the course. Be careful, and think about just watching the race.
As Grandfather trotted off, Joshua sighed.
You know, Fanny, maybe he's right.
We already heard that music
Let's try
cue.
again. Remember, Grandfather said it even took Charlie a while to get the hang of this. And
Yeah.
he's a great horse.
Off they sped again. As Jingle Bells' flying hooves sprayed snow everywhere, Fanny whispered to herself.
Jingle Bells just has to win.
You know what they say, practice makes perfect.
Finally, Christmas Day arrived.
A phrase I
It was clear and cold, and the center of town was crowded with horses and sleighs. Men, women, boys, and girls, grandfathers, and even a grandmother or two were holding the reins on colorful one-horse open sleighs.
like the lyric.
It took a while for all the sleighs to get into starting position. When everybody was lined up, the mayor fired the starting gun. They were off.
There's a vintage gunshot sound effect.
Started from the starting line. The muffled sound of hoofbeats on the snowy road sounded like distant thunder. Jingle Bells started out slowly, but steadily he closed in on the top 3 sleighs. Fanny shouted,
Look, the third sleigh. It's Grandfather and Charlie.
Joshua pointed ahead.
Better slow down, Fanny. We're coming to Calamity Curve.
Ooh, a name like Calamity.
Calamity Curve was the worst turn in the race.
Right.
Just as they were passing Grandfather and Charlie, Fanny tugged at Jingle Bell's reins. The horse slowed as he approached the treacherous curve. Gingerly, he trotted through the turn and began picking up speed again. Joshua looked around them.
Fanny, where did Grandfather and Charlie go?
Fanny glanced back over her shoulder.
Grandfather's over the edge. Charlie slipped on Calamity Curve. We'll have to go back.
She pulled at the reins. Just for a moment, Jingle Bells didn't understand. But Fanny kept tugging, and Jingle Bells slowed, then stopped. Fanny had trained him well.
Oh.
As the other horses and sleighs raced by, Fanny turned Jingle Bells around, and they headed back to Calamity Curve.
Fanny's a pretty name. If it weren't for,
When they arrived, Fanny tossed the reins to Joshua and jumped out of the sleigh. Moving through the deep drifts as fast as she could, she came to the scene of the crash. To the right was the sleigh. To the left, Charlie lay tangled in the reins. And between them, Grandfather was stuck in the snow up to his waist. Fanny called out.
Are you all right, Grandfather?
Grandfather was too cold and wet to answer, but he did manage a nod and a tired grin. Joshua hurried up behind her and began to dig Grandfather out of the snow. Fanny, meanwhile, untangled Charlie from the twisted reins and calmly led the chilled horse out of the drifts. They wrapped Grandfather in a warm blanket.
Oh, there's a
and
Disney
helped him
horse,
into the
Winnie.
sleigh. Then with Charlie trotting along behind, Jingle Bells pulled them toward home, where a big Christmas dinner was waiting. Grandfather put his arm around Fanny.
Well, it looks like Jingle Bells might make a farm horse after all. Of course, Charlie would have beaten him in the race if he hadn't slipped.
Fanny couldn't believe her ears.
Grandfather, Jingle Bells had already passed Charlie. We would have won.
Before Grandfather could answer, Joshua piped up.
I guess we'll have to wait until next Christmas to know for sure.
And everybody laughs ending. And even the horse is winning with them. And now for the song.
Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh. O'er the fields we go, laughing all the way. Bells on bobtail ring, making spirits bright.
Yep, the Disneyland Children's Chorus.
Sing a sleighing song tonight. Oh, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. Jingle bells, jingle bells.
Yeah, that recording came from this particular LP record from 1979. And for those who grew up with that Disney Christmas sing-along video for 1988, they used the same track in it, coupled with footage from the Once Upon a Wintertime segment from Melody Time. Yeah, that's a nice catchy beat though. Upsot. Jingle bells, Batman smells, Robin laid an egg. The Batmobile lost its wheel and the Joker got away. Sorry, couldn't resist. So you know Bart Simpson and the Joker made that popular? Now they repeat the first verse one last time. Ha ha ha! Right. Yeah, and in the sing-along, it looked like the horses were trotting to the beat, too.
That was the end of the story. If you would like to hear it again, turn the tape over.
Even though I don't do that, I like to play the end message for you all. Feels more complete that way. Pretty cute story, isn't it? A fun original tale named after the famous winter song that's about horses and is able to nicely incorporate Christmas into the story. And a neat art style that's different from your typical Disney fare. In fact, just looking at the book cover and the cassette, you wouldn't even know this is a Disney release. Now it is, if it wasn't for the stock back cover, the titles in the regular Disney read-along had from 1987 to 1990, with the Jungle Book sample pages. And the usual Disney read-along stock music cues playing in the background, and that rendition of Jingle Bells at the end, along with the packaging this read-along came in. Could have easily been made as part of the Buena Vista read-along titles that feature non-Disney properties like Rainbow Bride and Alvin and the Chipmunks and Alf and Gumby. But anyways, with my new appearance in the wonderful world of Mickey Mouse, they changed my official voice actor. So now I am voiced by Clancy Brown. Yes, the guy that voices Mr. Krabs in SpongeBob SquarePants. I know Jim Cummings is getting on in years, which is why he's not voicing Darkwing Duck or Don Carnage anymore. Or the Tasmanian Devil for Warner Brothers, but he still voices Pete. So maybe they finally decided Pete and I should sound different after all these years. After all, I've had a few mistake me for Pete at parties and conventions and such, although more tend to mistake me for Goofy. And the way I'm drawn at times in this episode wouldn't help very much either. But yeah, regarding voice changes, people are gonna know, despite what Ned Flanders once said about recasting voices in animation.
Plus, they can replace them and no one can tell the diddly difference.
Yeah, and it still makes the mind reel how Disney now owns that, and it's also on Disney Plus. It's been 3 years now since Disney announced they were going to buy 20th Century Fox, a deal completed last spring. But when I saw the script for that Mickey Mouse episode, I really had to wonder if it was written for furries in mind. I mean, we get vor, inflation, a big gut and butt from me, and look at how they composed this shot, and near my groin. Okay, maybe that's a little too raunchy. Well, you get the idea. The point is, it was lots of fun to do, and I'm glad I'm getting work lately, like Zach is with that electronics reselling and recycling company. So at least this difficult year is getting better for both of us. So maybe there is hope for Christmas. Well, keep watching this channel, and happy holidays, everyone!